The hospital hallways buzzed with activity as nurses rushed from one room to another. It was a typical evening in the maternity ward, doctors giving orders, expectant mothers in pain, and the occasional wail of a newborn filling the air. But in one particular labor room, something wasn't right. A young woman lay on the hospital bed, clutching her belly as another contraction rippled through her body. Her face twisted in pain, sweat beading on her forehead. She had been in labor for hours, exhausted and desperate for relief. But instead of comfort, all she got was ridicule. A nurse stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Oh, come on," she scoffed. "You're acting like the first woman to ever have a baby. It's not that bad." The woman's husband, standing beside her, tensed. He had been holding her hand, whispering reassurances, but the nurse's words made his jaw clench. His wife was in agony, and this was how she was being treated. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. The nurse, oblivious to his growing anger, rolled her eyes. "I've seen hundreds of women go through labor. Some of them handle it way better than this." She chuckled, shaking her head. "If you can't deal with a little pain, maybe you should have thought twice before getting pregnant." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. She had already been feeling vulnerable, scared, and overwhelmed. The last thing she needed was to be mocked in her moment of pain. She squeezed her husband's hand tighter, trying to block out the humiliation. But what the nurse didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined, was who the man standing beside the laboring woman truly was. He wasn't just a concerned husband. He wasn't just any ordinary visitor. He was the owner of the hospital. And he had heard enough. His eyes darkened as he looked at the nurse, his expression unreadable. For now, he said nothing, choosing instead to focus on his wife. But in his mind, one thing was certain. This nurse had just made the biggest mistake of her career. She just didn't know it yet. Here's the continuation of your story. The woman let out another pained cry, gripping the sheets as another contraction took over. Her husband's grip on her hand tightened, a silent promise that he was right there with her. But his patience was wearing thin. The nurse sighed dramatically, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "Seriously, it's just labor. Women have been doing this for centuries without all this whining," she muttered under her breath. The man's jaw clenched. He could feel his wife's hurt, not just from the pain of childbirth but from the humiliation of being treated like this. His instincts screamed at him to say something, to put this nurse in her place, but he forced himself to stay quiet for now. He wasn't just thinking about the moment, he was thinking about the kind of people working under his hospital's roof. If this was how one nurse behaved in front of a patient's husband, how did she treat those who had no one by their side? His wife gasped for breath, her other hand pressing against her stomach as she fought through another wave of pain. "Please, I need something for the pain," she managed to whisper. The nurse barely looked up. "You're not even that far along. If we start giving you pain meds now, what are you going to do when it gets worse?" She scribbled something on her clipboard and shook her head. "You need to toughen up." His wife's eyes filled with tears. She wasn't weak, she was exhausted. She had been in labor for hours, and every minute felt like a battle. This wasn't about being dramatic. She was in pain, and she needed help. The nurse turned away, muttering something under her breath as she stepped toward the door. The husband had heard enough. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. She barely glanced over her shoulder. "Yes?" He stood taller, his presence commanding even in the sterile hospital room. "Is this how you treat all your patients?" His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. A warning. The nurse turned fully now, clearly irritated. "Look, sir, I've been doing this job for years. Some women just exaggerate more than others." She gave a pointed look toward his wife. "I see it all the time." His hands curled into fists at his sides. He had spent years building this hospital into what it was today. He had personally vetted the kind of care he wanted every patient to receive. And yet, here was someone who had completely disregarded the core values he had fought so hard to instill. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "My wife isn't exaggerating," he said quietly. "She's in pain. And if she's asking for help, your job is to listen, not belittle her." The nurse let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, come on. You don't have to be so sensitive about it. It's just a little tough love." The man studied her, his expression unreadable. "What's your name?" She frowned, shifting slightly. "Why?" "Because I want to make sure I remember it." His voice was smooth, but there was something behind it, something the nurse couldn't quite place. She let out an awkward chuckle. "Oh, no need for that. I'm just doing my job." A knock at the door interrupted them, and another nurse peeked in. "Doctor's coming in soon. Do you need anything?" Before the husband could answer, the rude nurse waved her off. "No, we're fine. Just trying to get this one to calm down." The second nurse's brows furrowed as she glanced at the woman on the bed. Unlike her colleague, she immediately stepped forward, her expression softening. "Are you okay, ma'am? Do you need anything?" The laboring woman nodded weakly, relief washing over her at finally being asked. "Pain. I need something for the pain." The second nurse shot a look at the first one, confused. "She hasn't been given anything?" "She's barely dilated," the first nurse replied with a shrug. The second nurse pressed her lips together, then turned back to the patient. "I'll speak with the doctor right now." As she left, the first nurse sighed dramatically. Everyone's so sensitive these days. The husband's patience had finally run out. "You don't know who I am, do you?" The nurse blinked, then scoffed. "Should I?" He took a step forward, lowering his voice. "I own this hospital." For the first time, the nurse's confidence faltered. She let out a nervous laugh. "Yeah, right." But then she saw the way he was looking at her, steady, unwavering, completely serious. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure. Her stomach twisted. He held her gaze for a long moment, then looked down at his wife. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. She was exhausted. And this woman, this nurse, had made her feel worse when she was supposed to be helping her. He turned back to the nurse, his voice dangerously calm. "I'll be speaking with the hospital board about you." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The second nurse returned just then, a doctor following closely behind. "We're getting her something for the pain now," she assured the woman, then glanced at her husband, something flickering in her eyes as if she'd overheard just enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. The first nurse suddenly seemed much smaller than before, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of her own mistake. But the husband wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The room felt colder now, but it had nothing to do with the temperature. The air was thick with tension, pressing down on everyone inside. The nurse, who had spent the last hour mocking the laboring woman, suddenly looked uneasy. Her confidence was slipping, and for the first time, she seemed to realize that maybe, just maybe, she had made a terrible mistake. The woman on the bed let out another sharp cry, her entire body trembling from the pain. The second nurse, the one who had actually shown concern, moved quickly to her side. She adjusted the pillows, whispering words of comfort, and within minutes, a doctor walked in, scanning the scene with sharp, assessing eyes. "What's going on here?" the doctor asked, flipping through the patient's chart. His tone was firm but neutral, like a man used to handling chaos. The second nurse spoke first. "She's been in labor for hours, asking for pain relief." But she hesitated, glancing toward the first nurse. She wasn't given anything. The doctor's head snapped up. "What?" The first nurse shifted uncomfortably, gripping her clipboard tighter. She wasn't far enough along. "I was just following protocol." "That's not protocol," the doctor cut in, his expression darkening. We assess each patient's pain individually. You don't get to decide whose pain is real and whose isn't. The laboring woman let out a weak, shuddering breath, tears slipping down her face. Her husband squeezed her hand, his eyes locked on the nurse who had dismissed his wife's suffering. His anger was controlled, but there was something behind it, something stronger than rage. A quiet, dangerous resolve. The doctor wasted no time. Get her pain relief now. The second nurse nodded and rushed out, while the first one lingered, clearly unsure what to do. You, the doctor said, turning to her. Step outside. She swallowed hard but obeyed, her footsteps slow and hesitant. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, the woman's husband exhaled, rubbing his thumb over his wife's hand. It's okay, he murmured. You're okay now. Her breathing remained uneven, but she nodded, her fingers tightening around his. The doctor ran a quick assessment, checking her vitals, then turned to the husband. I'm sorry, the doctor said quietly, his voice filled with genuine regret. That never should have happened. The man nodded, appreciating the apology, but his mind was already elsewhere. This wasn't just about his wife anymore. How many other women had gone through this? How many had suffered in silence because they had no one to stand up for them? The thought made his stomach turn. The second nurse returned moments later with the necessary medication, and within minutes, the woman's pain eased, her body visibly relaxing for the first time in hours. Relief flickered across her face, though exhaustion still clung to her features. Her husband brushed damp strands of hair from her forehead. Better? She nodded weakly. Thank you. He kissed her knuckles, his heart heavy with emotions he wasn't ready to name. Then, slowly, he straightened, his expression sharpening once more. I need to step outside, he said, his voice calm but firm. The doctor gave a small nod, understanding. Take your time. With one last glance at his wife, he turned and walked toward the door. The second nurse caught his arm just before he left. I'm really sorry, she said, her eyes filled with guilt. She shouldn't be working here. He gave her a measured look. You did the right thing. And that's what matters. She let go, and he stepped into the hallway. The first nurse was standing there, arms crossed, but her face was pale. She knew now there was no escaping this. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What you did in there was unacceptable. She shifted on her feet, forcing out a weak laugh. Look, I didn't mean stop. His tone was sharp enough to make her mouth snap shut. You belittled a woman in pain. You ignored her suffering. And you made it clear that you don't belong here. The hallway was silent. Other nurses and staff were glancing over, sensing the weight of the moment. I didn't know who you were, she muttered, as if that made any difference. His eyes darkened. It shouldn't have mattered. Her breathing quickened. I've been here for years, and this is how you've been treating patients all those years? His voice was like ice. She swallowed hard, and for the first time, fear crept into her eyes. I will be reporting this, he continued. Every single thing you said, every moment of your neglect, will be reviewed. And I will make sure no one else has to go through what my wife did tonight. She opened her mouth again, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. The sound of hurried footsteps filled the hallway, and the hospital director appeared, his expression grave. He had clearly been called in after word spread. The husband turned to him without hesitation. We need to talk. And just like that, the walls the nurse had hidden behind for so long finally began to crumble. The hospital director's face was tight with concern as he walked up, glancing between the tense nurse and the man standing before him. He had worked with the hospital's owner long enough to know that if he was personally involved in something, it was serious. What happened? The director asked, his voice low. The husband took a steady breath, keeping his anger controlled. My wife was in labor for hours, in pain, and she was ignored. Mocked. This nurse, he gestured toward her, refused to give her the care she needed. If she treats the wife of the hospital's owner this way, I can only imagine how she treats others. The director's expression darkened, his gaze shifting toward the nurse, who looked visibly shaken now. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but no words came. The weight of what she had done was sinking in. I need a full report on this, the husband continued. I want to know if there have been other complaints. I want to know if this is a pattern. The director nodded. Understood. I'll start looking into it immediately. But just as he said that, a voice cut through the tension. There's no need for that. Everyone turned as a woman in a crisp hospital coat approached. She was older, her hair neatly pinned back, her sharp eyes scanning the scene like she already knew exactly what was happening. There was something about her presence, something calculating. The director stiffened. Dr. Reed. The husband's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew who she was. She was one of the senior administrators, someone who had been with the hospital for years, long before he had taken over. She had influence, power, and a reputation for handling situations quietly. Dr. Reed offered a thin smile. I heard there was an issue. The director hesitated. We were just discussing, I'm aware, she cut in smoothly, then turned to the nurse in question. Step into my office. Now. The nurse let out a shaky breath and hurried after her without hesitation. The husband watched them go, suspicion creeping into his gut. She's going to try to bury this, he muttered. The director let out a slow sigh. She handles internal matters. I don't want this handled, the husband said firmly. I want it fixed. The director nodded but didn't look convinced. The hospital had its politics, its quiet ways of sweeping things under the rug, and Dr. Reed had been a part of that system for a long time. The husband turned back toward the labor room, his frustration mounting. His wife was inside, finally resting, but the fact remained she had suffered because of the hospital's negligence. And now, there were people who wanted to make sure no one ever heard about it. He stepped inside the room, his eyes immediately softening when he saw his wife. She looked tired but better. The pain relief had helped, and the second nurse was adjusting her blanket, offering a kind smile. You're back, his wife murmured. He sat beside her, brushing his fingers over her knuckles. I had to deal with something. She gave him a knowing look. Did you get her fired? Not yet, he admitted. But I'm working on it. She sighed, shaking her head slightly. I don't want this to turn into something ugly. It's already ugly, he murmured. And it's not just about us. What if she does this to another mother? Someone who doesn't have someone fighting for her. Her lips pressed together. She knew he was right. The second nurse hesitated, then spoke up. There have been other complaints, she admitted quietly. Nothing major, nothing that was ever formally documented. But I've seen it. The way she talks to patients. The way she dismisses them. The husband's jaw tightened. That's exactly what I was afraid of. Just then, the doctor returned, flipping through a chart. Good news. You're progressing well. The baby should be here soon. His wife let out a breath of relief, and for a moment, the tension lifted. This was what mattered. Their child. Their family. But as the doctor continued his assessment, the husband's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't done. He couldn't be. Something told him this wasn't over yet. Hours passed, and the night stretched on. The hospital grew quieter, the usual chaos settling into a steady hum. But as the husband stepped out into a hallway for a moment, needing air, he noticed something. Down the hall, Dr. Reed's office door was slightly open, and inside voices were low but urgent. He took a step closer. I don't care who he is, Dr. Reed's voice hissed. We don't need this kind of attention right now. Find a way to smooth it over. A second voice, one he didn't recognize, responded. If he pushes for an investigation, We might have a problem. There was a pause, then Dr. Reed's voice again. Then make sure he doesn't. His stomach twisted. This wasn't just about one bad nurse. This was bigger. And now, he knew he wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting against a system that didn't want to be exposed. The husband stood frozen outside Dr. Reed's office, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. He had expected pushback, but this was more than that. This was calculated. The hospital wasn't just trying to avoid bad publicity. They were actively protecting people who had no business being in patient care. His grip tightened around his phone. He had recorded just enough of the conversation to prove what was happening. He turned away, walking briskly back toward his wife's room. He needed to be with her, needed to clear his head before making his next move. But as he reached the door, he found the second nurse waiting outside, her face pale. "You need to be careful," she said in a low voice. His eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing down the hall as if afraid someone might overhear. "I heard Dr. Reed's assistant making a call. They're trying to cover this up, but more than that. They're looking for a way to make you drop this." He clenched his jaw. "They can try." She exhaled, looking genuinely worried. "They've done it before. There have been complaints about mistreatment, and every time, the records disappear, or the patients suddenly change their stories. Some of them probably got settlements, but others, they were pressured. Told their care might be complicated if they didn't cooperate." His stomach twisted with disgust. This wasn't just incompetence. It was corruption. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. She bit her lip, then straightened her shoulders. "Because I became a nurse to help people. And I've seen too many patients suffer because of people like her." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you?" She exhaled in relief. "What are you going to do?" He looked toward his wife's room, where she was still resting, and made his decision. "End this." Without another word, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Within an hour, the hospital was buzzing. Not with the usual noise of patients and doctors, but with something different, something tense. The hospital board had been called in. Security had been placed outside Dr. Reed's office. And the first nurse, the one who had mocked his wife, was nowhere to be seen. The husband stood in the center of the conference room, facing the board members, his expression unreadable. He had laid everything out: the recording, the testimonies, the past complaints that had mysteriously disappeared. Dr. Reed sat across from him, her face carefully composed, but he could see the tension in her hands where they rested on the table. "This is ridiculous," she finally said, forcing a dry chuckle. "You think you can just barge in here, and I don't think," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I know." The board members murmured amongst themselves, flipping through the reports he had placed in front of them. Some of them looked disturbed, others angry. One of the senior board members cleared his throat. "Dr. Reed, these accusations are serious. We cannot overlook them." Dr. Reed's lips thinned. "And you're taking his word for it?" She gestured toward the husband. "He's upset. His wife had a bad experience, and now he's making it personal." The husband leaned forward slightly. "It is personal." His voice was steady. "And it should be. Because when a patient walks into this hospital, they trust us to take care of them. They don't expect to be ignored, belittled, or threatened into silence." Dr. Reed opened her mouth, but this time, another voice spoke up. The second nurse stepped forward. "I've seen it," she said, her voice firm despite the nerves in her eyes. "I've seen patients ignored. I've seen nurses and staff too afraid to speak up because they knew it wouldn't change anything." Dr. Reed shot her a glare. "This isn't the place for it's exactly the place for this." The board member interrupted, turning to her. "And I think we've heard enough." Silence stretched across the room. Dr. Reed exhaled sharply. "You can't fire me over this. I've been here for years. The board member exchanged glances with the others before speaking. You're right. We can't? He paused, then added, but we can launch a full investigation into every complaint, every erased record, and every decision you've made that has put this hospital's integrity at risk. For the first time, Dr. Reed's mask cracked. This meeting is over, the board member declared. Effective immediately, you are placed on leave pending the investigation. The husband watched as Dr. Reed stood, her face pale, her fists clenched. Without another word, she turned and walked out. The second nurse let out a breath of relief. The husband turned toward the board. There's one more thing. The board member raised an eyebrow. Yes? The nurse who mistreated my wife, she needs to be gone. The board member nodded. Consider it handled. The moment the meeting ended, the husband walked back toward his wife's room, exhaustion settling into his bones. He had done what he needed to do. When he stepped inside, his wife was awake, watching him with quiet curiosity. You look tired, she murmured. He chuckled softly, sitting beside her. It's been a long night. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Did you fix it? He exhaled. Not everything. But it's a start. A nurse walked in then, smiling warmly. It's time, she said softly. His wife inhaled sharply, then nodded. The moment had finally arrived. He squeezed her hand. Let's meet our baby. And just like that, the chaos of the night faded into the background. Because in this moment, nothing else mattered. The hours that followed passed in a blur. The pain, the exhaustion, the anxious waiting, all of it melted away the moment their baby's first cry filled the room. Relief washed over the husband as he looked at his wife, who was breathless and teary-eyed but smiling. The nurse gently wrapped the tiny newborn in a soft blanket and carefully placed them in his wife's arms. She let out a small, shaky laugh as she stared down at their child, her fingers tracing the little one's delicate features. She's perfect, she whispered. The husband swallowed the lump in his throat, leaning in closer. She really is. The past 24 hours had been some of the hardest of their lives, but in this moment, everything felt right. The world outside the hospital, politics, the fight for justice, the people who had tried to silence them, none of it mattered. All that mattered was this tiny new life in their arms. The nurse smiled warmly. She's healthy, and so are you. You did amazing. His wife exhaled, sinking into the pillows. I still can't believe it's over. The husband brushed a strand of hair from her face. Not just over. It's a new beginning. She looked up at him, something soft and knowing in her eyes. You took care of it, didn't you? He nodded. As much as I could. Dr. Reed is being investigated. That nurse won't be working here anymore. And hopefully, this hospital will finally start treating people the way they should. A shadow of worry passed over her face. What if nothing changes? It will, he promised. Because now, people are paying attention. She let out a slow breath, nodding as she looked down at their baby. I hope so. The next few hours were quiet, peaceful. Friends and family came by, filling the room with warmth and love. The hospital staff seemed different now, more attentive, more careful. The second nurse, the one who had spoken up, stopped by to check on them personally, her relief evident. I just wanted to say, thank you, she said softly. For standing up for the patients here. For standing up for us. The husband shook his head. You're the one who had the courage to speak out. She smiled. Still. This place needed change for a long time. And maybe now, it'll actually happen. As the sun set outside the hospital window, the husband sat beside his wife, watching their daughter sleep in her arms. He thought about everything that had happened, the anger, the frustration, the fight for something better. It hadn't been easy. And it wasn't over. Change took time. But as he looked at his family, he knew one thing for certain. Some things were always worth fighting for.